Somebody just take my wallet away from me, please. It's the C64. So, I was interested in this one specifically because I'm not that familiar with the Commodore 64. So, I got this because I really wanted to play around with just sort of an older 8-bit computer, kind of work with the old text command line interface, basic interface, and just play around with it, see if I can get pretty decent at it. So let's get this open. The first thing I should mention is that a lot of times you will see this referred to in videos and certain listings as the C64 Maxi. However, you do not see Maxi anywhere on the actual box or on the actual item itself. I believe this is more of a colloquial name. A lot of people just call it that to differentiate it from another product that I believe the same company makes called the C64 Mini. And in fact, to just differentiate it from the Commodore 64 original itself. Another thing, though, is that saying that it doesn't actually say Commodore on the box anywhere at all. And I assume that is a rights thing, even though the name Commodore isn't exactly a hot commodity anymore. I don't know if anybody remembers the Commodore 64 phone, or the Commodore phone. It was basically just like a cheap Chinese OEM smartphone running Android and has like some basic Commodore software on it. Like it had a Commodore emulator on it, I think, and just some general old school computer theming. So this has 64 games built in on it. Hardy har har. It has micro switch joysticks, which are pretty cool. And no need putting it off any longer. Let's just open this thing. Ooh, plastic. And here we have the thing itself. Wow, okay. Oh, these keys are, like, weirdly shaped. Not bad, though. This feels kind of... Oh, how do I put this? It doesn't feel cheap, but it does feel kind of weird, if that makes sense. Like, this feels like no other keyboard or computer that I've ever felt before. This thing is actually decently heavy, too, especially considering how little is supposedly in this. Apparently, it's just like a tiny little thing on a chip that's like a Linux-based thing. I guess maybe they sort of weighed it down a little bit to make it feel a little bit more like the actual Commodore 64. But, oh god, I love that sound, though. Yeah! Yes. God, I love it. Let's look at the controller. That is also in the box. It looks like it only comes with one, so it has multiple USB ports on the side, but only comes with one controller. And here it is. So, yeah, that is indeed micro. So, oh god, that feels nice. Oh man, and the buttons are micro switch too? Okay, I love this. Impressions. This is, I was a little bit afraid that this would be kind of like the old Atari controllers where they're really, really stiff. And kind of, yeah. These are this is kind of the stiff controller. Very loud, too, if you can pick that up. But, it should be fine for the games that utilize it. The original Commodore 64 never had, like, any sort of analog inputs. So, you don't really need a lot of travel on it. But, yeah, there is not a lot of travel on this joystick. I believe it is modeled after a Competition Pro, from what I've heard. I think this is just different cables. I am hoping also that this comes with an instruction manual, because if not, I might be stuck for doing some of the more advanced stuff. Oh, it does come with... Oh, I was expecting this wouldn't come with an AC adapter, but it does. Not sure I'll need it, because usually you can kind of just plug these things in through USB to your television, but it's nice that it's included. Speaking of which, this is USB cable, pretty standard micro USB, and it does come with HDMI as well. So that is really nice. Let me just, one last time, look through the box, make sure... Oh! Okay, I found the manual. Okay, good. This is... this is, like, really small, though. Hopefully it at least tells you how to put ROMs on it, because it's possible that might be kind of a worry. So, that is it. I'm going to hook this thing up now and see if we can get some games on it. All right. The lights are off, the system's plugged in, and the videography is as guerrilla as humanly possible. I suppose those are the ideal circumstances for the Commodore C64 64K memory system by Commodore. Lovely. I'm sure that jingle would have been very nice if my TV hadn't cut it off. Let's do English. And let's just go to the classic mode for right now. We'll look at the carousel later. Oh, there we go. And yeehaw! All right, we are ready. I'm going to type a very modern reference that I'm sure all the young people will understand. Okay, and let's go. War games! What, syntax error? You're serious? You can't even war games on this thing? Absolutely useless. Alright, so what we're going to do now is look at some of the games that are included on this system's carousel.
Disclaimer. While the opinions expressed are 100% my own, and I have actually played every game in this segment, I do not have an HDMI capture device, and as a result, I have decided for the best possible quality to source gameplay footage from YouTube. I do plan on crediting all the sources that I have used in this video, so it's not technically stealing, right? Also, while I will be covering later firmware updates and games included in them, for right now in this segment, I will only be covering the games that are included in my system stock, as I imagine that's what a lot of people buying the system will be doing anyway. That being said, let's get started. First up, we have Allycat. It's a little bit like a precursor to the old pod racing games on Nintendo 64, except it's not very good. There's not a ton to this game, and you can more or less just stay in one general area and do pretty well in it. Anarchy, not the philosophy I particularly subscribe to, but to each their own. This is a pretty interesting game. Think like Battle City on NES mixed with Tower of Druaga, and you have a pretty good idea of the general idea of this game. Basically, you have to shoot all the blocks, avoid the droids, and find the exit, all in under 2 minutes. All in all, it's a pretty interesting game, and definitely kept my attention. I'm not 100% on the sound effects used in this game, but regardless, it is pretty interesting to hear such sounds on a computer this old. I did always admire the SID chip, and honestly, that's sort of why I bought this system in the first place. Avenger. Yeah, I didn't really like this one. It's a Gauntlet clone, and admittedly a very ambitious one with nice pretty graphics and a large open world, but that kind of comes at the detriment of gameplay. The play area is very zoomed in to accommodate the large and detailed sprites, and as a result, you won't really see enemies until it's too late a lot of the time. Not to mention, there's no post-hit invincibility, so you will have an enemy latch on to you before you get a chance to react, and it will take at least some of your health. Also, there's this weird mechanic where, for some reason, you can't shoot without pressing a direction on the joystick while pressing the fire button. I'm not really sure why it does this, because it's not like the fire button does anything while you're standing still, at least as far as I can tell. So, it's just this weird handicap that's put in the game for seemingly no reason. Ambitious, yes, but kind of overly ambitious, if you ask me. Battle Valley, and reason number 573 why I love the SID chip. Yeah, a lot of these Commodore games just had amazing soundtracks. So, this game is sort of like Choplifter, if I could compare it to anything, but there are a few differences that are pretty noteworthy. For starters, you aren't rescuing hostages or anything like that, you're just blowing things up, either on the ground or in the air. For the ground, you have a tank, and for the air, you have a helicopter. That is pretty much all you do in this game, though, so I imagine it could get a little tiring after a little while, but from what I played, it's pretty fun, kind of figuring out all the mechanics involved in the game and understanding its learning curve. Boulder Dash, possibly the most famous Commodore 64 game, and a very good one at that. Nice, old-school, arcade-style puzzle game, kind of like Dig Dug, but with some added mechanics and collectibles. Amazingly, I haven't actually played it before this, which is surprising, because it was ported to just about everything, including the NES. Breakdancing. I can just imagine this being pitched. A bunch of people in a boardroom settled around one of those long tables, and the CEO with his Monopoly Man mustache asks them all, "So, what do the kids want? What can we sell? Give me some ideas." And then they all go around talking about stupid stuff like plumbers and hedgehogs and things, and one guy goes up and he's like, "Now, hear me out, guys. Hear me out. What if breakdancing?" And then the other people were just like, "Wait, what? What? Break? Really?" But all the other ideas sucked, so they went with that. This is a rhythm game, kind of like Dragon's Lair or Dance Dance Revolution without the interactivity. It's one of those things where once you play it enough and memorize everything, you can get pretty good at it, but the entire game is just a boring grind to get to that point. It's fine, I guess, but, like, seriously, who asked for this? Chip's Challenge. I actually used to have this game on the Atari Lynx years ago, and even featured it in one of my very first YouTube videos. Basically, it is a really good puzzle game, a little bit like Sako Ban, but with more enemies, obstacles, and mechanics to make it feel more fresh and updated. This version on the C64, however, is not nearly as good. Granted, it is playable, sure, but things like the graphics, music, and sound effects, if you decide to turn the music off, leave a lot to be desired. Granted, if I hadn't played the Atari Lynx version and had been so familiar with it, I probably wouldn't be complaining, because the gameplay is still pretty intact. But overall, if you've never played Chip's Challenge, I highly recommend one of the far better ports on various different consoles. There's even a sequel that came out a couple years ago on Steam, which includes the original. So check that out if you're interested. Confeuzion, spelled with a Z because that's cool, I guess. This is one of those marble maze-style sliding puzzle things. There's been a million different versions of this game before and after this one, except here you're trying to complete a circuit. Admittedly, I had more fun with this game than I was expecting, but I might be alone on that. Overall, there are definitely other C64 games I would have rather seen take this spot. Cyberdine Warrior. This is basically the C64's answer to Metroid. You have the sci-fi theme that's an obvious homage to Alien or maybe Terminator, different enemies, power-ups, and collectibles, a large open world, and a really, really good soundtrack. Normally it wouldn't play during the game, but I dubbed it in because you're welcome. Cybernoid and Cybernoid 2. I'm including these together because they're both more or less the same. This is sort of like a space shooter, but you have more narrow passageways and you can go on the ground, so it's also a little bit like a 2D platformer. It has really nice graphics, really good music, but the gameplay is a little bit too difficult for its own good in my opinion. I give the same advice I give to just about any musical. Just listen to the soundtrack. Deflector. While on the surface this might seem a little bit like Confeuzion, as both games require you to complete a circuit by rotating different items, that's sort of where the similarities end. This is a far more involved game, and honestly a more difficult one. But here I feel like the difficulty leads to a much bigger payoff once you finally figure out the puzzle. Overall, I recommend this one if you are a fan of puzzle games. Destroyer. I have absolutely no idea how to play this game, and that's after looking at the manual. So, basically, it's a Navy sim, and from what I could gather in the manual, you can control different aspects of the Navy boat. You can control the depth charger, you can control the sonar, the navigation, and that's all done through different key commands. Honestly, I would have preferred they just either A, mapped it to the function keys, or B, mapped it to different numbers on the keyboard or something like that. So the way that they do it is a little bit of a hassle. Overall, very ambitious game for the time, and very in-depth for what it is, but I wish it could have been handled a little bit more easily. I'm not sure this has aged particularly well. Everyone's a Wally. What a stupid name. This is the third game in the Wally's Week series, and the only one to appear on this system. It's basically a puzzle platformer where you do various different fetch quests around town as different members of Wally's family in order to earn some money. While this might have been a pretty innovative idea for its time, and while some people, specifically those who spell color with an extra U, might have some nostalgia for it, this game is just far too primitive, dull, and just overall not interesting enough for me to see any sort of value in playing it today. In fact, I think the most interesting thing about this game is that there's a novelty single on the B-side of the original cassette by Mike Berry, and it's just fantastic. Check it out. Firelord. This one's actually pretty good. So imagine if Berserk had a point. What I mean by that is, imagine if instead of just trying to shoot as many enemies as possible to get a high score, there was an end goal to it all. There was a reason to keep exploring the world. Well, that's essentially what Firelord is. It's a maze-style adventure game where you go around different screens collecting items, weapons, and health in order to explore more of the area. While the map itself is consistent, the items are random, and I could understand why that would frustrate some people, but for me, I really enjoyed it. It has a surprising amount of depth, especially for a game of its vintage. Gateway to Apshai. I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. So you're familiar with Rogue, correct? The Arc of Apshai trilogy. This is another entry into the Apshai series of games, and a far, far, far more ambitious one. Instead of just a traditional dungeon crawler, this one is actually an old school RPG, long before the days of Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. You have healing abilities, various weapons, shields, all of which you can buy with money that you find in-game. It's a really ambitious game for its time, and I would find it hard to believe if this didn't directly inspire not only the RPGs I previously mentioned, but many other JRPGs, CRPGs, and in general just dungeon crawlers for years to come. Check this one out, not only if you're interested in a slice of gaming history, but in general just a really fun and in-depth game. Gribly's Day Out. We now return to your regularly scheduled WTF, already in progress. No, seriously, what is this game, and who created it, and should we do a wellness check on them? Basically, you play as Gribly, a Blobgonian who has the power of levitation and psychosis. And your goal is to collect your children, those are those little blob things, and return them to their base. It is a very difficult game, however, with a pretty steep learning curve. It's a unique idea for sure, but one that I imagine could get pretty repetitive once you've actually mastered this game's learning curve and gotten to a certain skill level. Heartland! Heartburn, more like. This might honestly be one of, if not the, worst game I have ever played. And the saddest part is that there was actual effort and ambition put into this, and they still screwed it up. They got just about every single mechanic of this game wrong, including opening a door. I kid you not, let me explain. So in order to go through a door, you have to orient yourself in the correct direction. You do this by either tapping left or right on the joystick, whatever one is the opposite direction in which you are facing. Then you have to press either up or down on the joystick, depending on which direction the door leads. So if you're in a door, you have to press down to go out of it. And if you're out of a door, you have to press up to go in it. Why they make you do this, and why they don't just map it to the up button like every game before and after, I have absolutely no idea. And that wouldn't be so bad, but there are enemies on the screens where the doors are. So you constantly get hit by the enemy while you're trying to figure out the broken control system. And that wouldn't even be so bad, but you don't even get a weapon immediately. You have to find it. This is just pure garbage. The fact that somebody released this and then years later somebody thought this game was worthy of being put on a system quite honestly astounds me. If this is Heartland, then I'm glad I fly over it every time I go to my vacation in California. Herobotix. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, we have this game, which is actually really good. It's a top-down, maze-like adventure game, a little bit like Saberwolf or something like that, but you have things like computer terminals where you can have a map screen, type in codes that activate and deactivate different elements of the area, and a lot more. This one's surprisingly in-depth, especially for a game of its time, and well worth a look. Highway Encounters. This is an interesting game that's pretty good, but could have been a lot better if executed properly. It's a little bit like Zaxxon meets Lemmings, in that you're shooting things in an isometric view, but you also have to command your group and allow them to move further on. You do this by shooting obstacles out of the way and ensuring a safe path for them to move forward. It's a pretty cool idea. The thing that ruins it a little bit is the controls. I think the idea behind it was novel. Basically, instead of moving freely, you move with Resident Evil-style tank controls, before the advent of Resident Evil. It's an interesting idea because a lot of isometric games before and after this had a serious problem with directional awareness. You had to almost play these games sideways in order to have a clear sense of how the direction worked because of the perspective that it was using. Whereas here, you just rotate your character in a direction and press up on the joystick to move. The problem is you can only move in a certain amount of direction, and as a result, you spend a lot more time than you need to trying to wrestle with the controls in order to shoot the thing that you want to shoot. I would have preferred you either A, move freely like normal, or B, had a greater means of control that wasn't so restrictive. As it stands, the game is alright, and if you can master the controls, I think you might have a good time with this one. Hunter's Moon. A simple game with an equally simple premise. Basically, you get caught in a black hole and you have to traverse through 180 plus levels in order to get back home. You do this by trying to find the portal that will take you to the next level, all the while dodging electric beams, aliens, and other such space junk. It's a pretty simple game, but deceptively addicting. And the graphics and sound are really nice on this one. I think you would have a good time. Hysteria. This is a run-and-gun shooting game, and that's about it, really. Not a ton of enemy variety, no real power-ups as far as I can tell. You can go in both directions, which sets it apart from games like Contra, but at the end of the day, it was probably pretty groundbreaking for its time, but pretty outdated by today's standards. Much like the Def Leppard album by the same name.
Visitor. Stay a while. Stay forever.
Now that we fulfilled that quota, Impossible Mission. Wonder where they got the inspiration for that. You're a spy going around collecting passwords to deactivate the computers, all the while avoiding the enemy's robots and trying not to fall to your doom. This is one of the more popular games on the system and pretty much had to be in this collection, but it is pretty fun. It was ported to a bunch of different systems, but the C64 version may be the most popular version, if for no other reason than those classically primitive, yet satisfyingly nostalgic voice samples. Imposable Mission 2. More or less the same game, but with better graphics and more fleshed out mechanics, so a pretty standard but worthy upgrade. Only thing is that the sound samples are now missing, and replaced with, honestly, pretty annoying sound effects. I.O. This is a 2D space shooter with pretty decent graphics and sound, and while it might look fun, it's unfortunately not. Really, the biggest problem with the game comes down to its difficulty. It's too difficult. And this wouldn't be a problem if the difficulty could be overcome by skill, but that's not what we're dealing with here. What we're dealing with is a game that entirely evolves around trial and error. Dying a whole bunch of times, memorizing when and where to shoot, in order to get better at the game and progress forward. This is a mentality that was taken from the arcade, and from a business sense there, it makes sense. You want the game to be more difficult so that people can put more quarters into the machine. But here, obviously, you pay for the game once, so it doesn't need to be this difficult. Honestly, there are better space shooters, even on the C64, so you can skip this one. Jumpman and Jumpman 2, also known as Jumpman Jr. While these games might look like crappy Donkey Kong knockoffs, and clearly that's what they were inspired by, there's a lot more to this than might meet the eye. A lot more collectibles, more gameplay elements, more hazards to uncover, and in general, just more levels with more variety. I'm covering both of these games together because they're both more or less the same, but honestly, I can easily recommend you play either one. You're guaranteed for some good old school arcade style action either way. Mega Apocalypse. This game is just a technical marvel. Let's get this out of the way. With music, graphics, and sound, especially the sound samples, that are better than some 16-bit games I've seen. The gameplay itself was pretty fun too. It's a simple game, something that could be done on an Atari 2600, but its simplicity adds to its pick-up and play ability. Essentially, your job is just to shoot waves of enemies, and eventually it gets harder, but you have different power-ups that add to the playability and replayability. Overall, it's just a really fun game. Check this one out. Mission AD. This is another run-and-gun shooter. Reminds me a little bit of Impossible Mission mixed with Rolling Thunder. Not a perfect comparison, but close enough. Overall, it's fun for a couple of minutes, but gets repetitive fairly quickly, and I imagine you'll be bored with it after a while. Monty on the Run. This was a pretty popular game, especially in the UK, where it was ported to a bunch of different early 8-bit computers. And I can see why it's so loved. It's a pretty standard flip-screen maze platformer, the likes of which were not uncommon on early computers at the time. But it's a fun game, and it's complemented by that amazing Rob Hubbard soundtrack. Definitely worth a shot. Netherworld. Yes, the music is amazing. No, it doesn't play during games, so I'm layering it in. And yes, if I talk about every C64 game that has amazing music, that's pretty much all I'm going to talk about, so let's just move on. The game itself is pretty fun too. I mean, imagine if it wasn't. All of the fodder that the angry reviewers could get out of a game called Netherworld. Beyond that, it's sort of like Defender, but with more gameplay mechanics, a wider world to explore, and just in general, more to do. It's a really fun game. Definitely one of the best on this collection. Nobby the Aardvark. This is actually the newest game in this collection, coming out as late as 1993. And it's pretty apt, considering the graphics and sound are some of the best we've seen up to this point. Beyond that though, the game is pretty fun as well. Pretty standard Euro platformer. A little bit difficult, especially when dealing with some of the moving platforms, but otherwise pretty good. Nose of Yezod and Arc of Yezod. Both games in the series play more or less the same. You have to go around rescuing these people in these craters, and then come out of this little mech suit and shoot people on the different screens. It's pretty similar to a lot of these maze-style platformers, except arguably a little bit more advanced. It's fun if you like this type of game. Paradroid. This is an interesting one. So you're a droid, a paradroid perhaps, and you have to go around shooting other droids. The way you do this though is pretty unique. You can just shoot them with your laser sometimes, much like plenty of other shooters we've already seen in this collection. Or you can go into this 1v1 battle mode, where you have to shoot the droids that way. You can only shoot the droids who have a number somewhere and around yours. If the number is too high, the droid is more likely to kill you. I think the way that you're supposed to do it is to stop the number at the correct coordinates in order to shoot the droid. Although I can't be sure about that. I'll admit I was pretty confused, but the people who have grown up with this game swear by it, so who am I to argue? Pitstop 2. Finally, we get to our first racing game in this collection, and it's a pretty good one. Graphics are nice for the system, sound is good, controls are tight. It does exactly what it's supposed to do. You can even type in your name for a high score, which is pretty cool, especially for someone like me who's used to the NES, where that was more of a rarity. Ranarama. So, here's an interesting one. Basically, it's Frogger, but a dungeon crawler. It's sort of like Rogue, where everything is top-down and it's all procedurally generated. Everything is random and you won't get the same map twice. That being said, it's also like Frogger in that, well, for starters, you play as a frog, and two, everything is set to a grid. You hop from one space to another. Overall, it's a pretty interesting idea. I definitely never would have thought of it, but someone in the 80s did. I will say, though, that out of all of the games on this system, this one seems to have given me the most problems. To a point where I've had to reset the game a couple of times because it just froze or glitched out on me. Robin of the Wood. Here's another maze-style flip-screen adventure game, and another pretty good one. Are you starting to notice a pattern here? Essentially, it's Robin Hood, and if you know one thing about Robin Hood, you know that he was a master of the bow and arrow, so naturally, the objective of this game is to navigate the maze, complete objectives, and shoot enemies with said bow and arrow. The biggest problem I have with this game is that it spawns you at random points in the map. And as far as I can ascertain, even the original game's manual didn't come with a map. That being said, there are plenty of maps to be found online, so at least it has that for it. Regardless, this is pretty fun, if for no other reason than the amazing music and the ability to just go around killing enemies being satisfying as all hell. Silicon Warrior. Here's a pretty fun one. Basically, it's a puzzle game where the objective is to get 5 of your color blocks in a row before your opponents do. You can play multiplayer or with up to 3 computer players, and there are a variety of different modes, including black holes, laser fire, shields, or any combination of those 3 pretty much. It's a really fun and addicting game, especially with multiple people, and the pseudo 3D graphics are pretty impressive for the C64. Definitely recommended you check this one out. Very fun. Skate Crazy. This is a skateboarding game where the objective is to go around an obstacle course and finish it in as little time as possible. The controls are pretty simple, just the joystick moves you and the fire button jumps. It's all pretty simple, and while I don't personally care for these kinds of games, I imagine that if you do, you'll have a fun time with this one. Skool Daze. You're a student, and your objective is to collect shields and find the code to unlock a safe, all the while making sure that you get to your lessons on time and don't misbehave too much, because if you get over 10,000 lines, the game is over and you are expelled from school. You can do that, or you can just go around wreaking havoc, punching random teachers and fellow students. So it's sort of like Postal 2, albeit without the ability to prod people to death with a cow's head and piss on their corpse. It's a pretty innovative game. I'll be honest, I don't know if I personally enjoyed it too much, but it was pretty popular, especially in the UK, on systems like the ZX Spectrum, which admittedly kind of had a better port, but this one is still pretty playable. Snare. Basically, go through a floor, avoid the obstacles, use the fire button to jump, and the direction buttons to rotate the screen, and once you've done that 20 times, you've beaten the game and gotten the billionaire's treasure. It's an alright game, I guess, but not one of the better ones, I would argue, on this collection. Speedball and Speedball 2. While these games were definitely more well-known on the 16-bit machines of the time, like the Atari ST and the successor to this system, the Commodore Amiga, they were both ported to the C64, and admittedly, they are both pretty playable. Essentially, it's soccer, but in the future! So everything moves a lot faster, it's all a lot more arcadey, and essentially the goal is to get it from one side of the playing field to the other in order to score a goal. These are both pretty fun games, more or less the same from what I can tell, but with different graphics. I'm sure you will have fun with either one. Spin Dizzy. Essentially, it's Marble Madness, if Marble Madness was an isometric adventure game. So, you have to go through a physics-based maze and collect gems. It is a very difficult game, and the controls are, quite honestly, a bit slippery, but you do get quite a lot of lives, and there actually is an in-game map, even though it's not accessible at all times. That being said, the inclusion of a map at all in-game is a welcome thing that I wish was in a lot of these other games, but these games are 30 years old. Not much sense in nitpicking what it should have done by today's standards. The Games Games. These are a series of sports compilation games released by Epix, and there's a few of them included on this system, including Winter Games, Summer Games 2, not the first one for some reason, California Games, and World Games. Most of these games are pretty similar. You have to input a combination of different directions on the joystick and buttons, and it requires a pretty steep learning curve. These games would really benefit from you looking at the manual, and the sad part about this and all games on this system is that none of the games include it. Granted, at least for these games, the manual is pretty easy to find online, but I don't think it would have been too difficult to include a PDF scan of the manual, or even like a QR code that you could scan on your phone. That being said, if you're into this sort of thing, it can be a lot of fun, especially world games, as it includes a lot of sports that you wouldn't normally find these days, like barrel jumping and cliff diving. The Street Sports games. This was Epic's other sports collection, and sort of juxtaposes that other series. Whereas California games, winter games, etc. required you to learn complex button combinations and look at the manual, these games are a lot easier to pick up and play. There are 3 included on this system: baseball, soccer, and basketball. There was also an American football game released, but it is not included on this system. Overall, while I don't personally care for sports games, I did quite like this series. And you might too. Super Cycle. So, you know the Sega arcade game Hang On, right? The Sword of Fargol. It's a dungeon crawler where you go around uncovering land within the dungeon, defeating enemies, and picking up different items. It is extremely basic, and what I mean by that is this may as well have been the first game ever made. From the graphics right down to the gameplay itself and the mechanics in which it's played. There are plenty of games on this system, many of which are included on the C64 itself, that stand the test of time, whether down to being genuinely fun to play, or just unique enough to marvel at them. This falls under neither one of those categories, and it's just dated and obsolete. In my opinion, you can skip over this one. It's not very fun. Thing on a Spring. Name kinda says it all, really. It's another maze-style 2D platformer, but this one especially was really big, especially in the United Kingdom. And I can see why. It might not look like much by today's standards, but keep in mind this came out the exact same year as Super Mario Bros., and not only features the same left-to-right scrolling as the before-mentioned game, but also a much larger world. Honestly, it's a pretty big technical marvel, especially considering it came out on a system that, in a lot of ways, was technically inferior to the NES. It's pretty cool on those grounds alone, and in general a pretty fun game overall. Coil Cop, otherwise known as Thing Bounces Back, otherwise known as What the Fire-Belching Hell Were They On When They Made This? This is the sequel to Thing on a Spring, and, well, it's a game, I guess. It's pretty cool. Again, a technical marvel, much like the first game, but yeah, just take your motion sickness pills before playing, for your own sake. Tower Toppler. You're this rat fish thing, and you have to go around a tower, shooting enemies, collecting items, and going to the next floor. This is a pretty basic game, and in my opinion, it's not very fun. It was also released under various different names, including Nebulous in Europe and Castellian when it was ported over to the NES. And it was pretty crap there too. Look, there are just better games you could have released on the C64. Why did you need to release this one? Trailblazer and Cosmic Causeway. Both of these games are pretty fun, kind of like 3D World Runner on NES or one of the many endless runner-style mobile games like Temple Run or Subway Surfers. That being said, this one is a lot more involved, more obstacles to avoid, more things to collect, and at least in the first game, Trailblazer, you have the ability to do multiplayer. You can't do that in the sequel, Cosmic Causeway, but that's substituted with better graphics and sound, plus, from what I can gather, more balanced gameplay. Both of these games are pretty fun, depending on what you want. Both are pretty difficult to master, but once you do, they're pretty enjoyable. Uridium! I have absolutely no idea what that means, but quite honestly, I think we're on space shooter number 55,000 out of 64, so I've just stopped caring at this point. That being said, it's sort of like Defender, and the graphics are pretty nice, especially the drop shadow effect on the spaceship. This game was released on the NES as The Last Starfighter, to tie in with the obscure 1984 space opera of the same name, which, interestingly enough, was directed by Nick Castle, who horror fans might know as the original Michael Myers in the 1978 Halloween movie. Honestly, that's kind of the most noteworthy thing about this game, otherwise it's just like every other space shooter on the system.
Yeehaw! Step right up for West Bank, the most desirous, rootinest, tootinest, cowboy shootinest game on that there Commodore 64. This game's got everything, cowboys, vigilante justice, and the finest 8-bitness prostitutes that 1980s sensitivities will allow. It's like Wild Gunman, but with a joystick.
Why you gotta use a joystick? That's like a baby's toy.
It's even got jaunty tunes. Granted, it could have benefited from some stupid cartoon sound effects, but never fear. Where 1987 falls short, you best believe we got you covered. It's got it all!
Or in short, it's alright.
Who Dares Wins 2? What the hell did I just read? This is your pretty standard run-and-gun arcade shooting affair. And while similar games like Akari Warriors and Commando probably cost a lot more considering they came from much larger studios, this is not a bad alternative. I think you could have some fun with this one. And finally, we have Xenaps, or Zynaps, I have absolutely no idea. The final game included on the stock C64 system, and god damn it, it's another space shooter. Well, admittedly, this one is a more standard affair, sort of like Gradius or R-Type, but not nearly as good as either one of those games. You have these things that you can collect, which really just increase your score. There's no power-ups, it's all pretty basic. Technically, there's nothing really wrong with it, I suppose. It's just, there are better space shooters, even on this system. Don't waste your time.
And thus we've come to the end of our list, and well, what can I say, really? We've got some good games, some bad games, and we've got Heartland, so a pretty mixed bag overall. However, some of the games might be slightly better than I give them credit for, but there is one major problem, at least with my system. The games, for the most part, run slightly too fast, and I think I know why this might be. The United States uses a slightly different power standard than the United Kingdom, and as I've said many times, a lot of these games were made and primarily played over in the UK. For example, here's how Monty on the Run is supposed to play. And here's how it runs on my system. And the reason for this is, again, we have a slightly different power standard. The UK runs at 50 Hz and we run at 60 Hz NTSC. Now, there is an option to supposedly change between NTSC and PAL on this system. However, from my experience, it doesn't seem to work. And it also seems to affect games that I load on here myself. Now, theoretically, an update would be able to fix this. However, I've heard conflicting reports on that as well. Some say it does work, some say it doesn't. So, there's only one way to find out. Let's update the system to the newest firmware.
Updating the C64 is extremely easy. I'm going to be doing this on my iPad, but you can do this on your Mac or PC. All you need to do is go into retrogames.biz, and once you get to the home page, you're going to want to go into products, and as you can see, there are several different products that this company manufactures. We're going to go into the C64, click on support, and go down to upgrade the firmware. Scroll down a little bit and we will see that the newest software update for the system is 1.6.1. My system came stock with 1.4.2, and what that says to me is you're going to want to update it pretty much as soon as you take it out of the box, because most likely they aren't going to do that for you. So all you need to do is click the download button. It'll open up Google Drive. Obviously, if this was a desktop, it would just launch the website. And you're going to want to click download, or in my case, open in. Now, there is one other thing that you're going to want to download if you are running a Mac and PC, and that is GUI Format. It's a free piece of software. I will leave a link to that in the description. And basically what that does is allows you to format your storage media to FAT32. Why this is important is FAT32 is the only thing that the C64 will recognize. And most modern operating systems, Mac OS and Windows, no longer support FAT32. They support things like exFAT and NTFS, which are far more secure than FAT32, but FAT32 is still more widely accepted as a file format. So once you open up GUI Formatter, it's a fairly simple product. You're going to want to select the drive letter. Usually it's going to be like D, E, maybe F. C drive is usually where your computer is stored. And you're going to want to format the drive. This will erase anything that's on the drive, so be warned of that. Next, you're going to want to save to files. And you're going to want to go down to your SD card. Mine just happens to be called Sony. Yours is whatever you decide to name it. And you're going to want to select Save. Once you do that, it will save the update file to the root of your SD card. That's where you want it to be anyway. You don't want it to be in any sort of folder. You just want it to be in the root directory of your SD card, the first thing that you see when you open it up. And that's really it. Now let's go over to the C64 and apply the update.
So once you're done, you can eject your storage media from your computer and plug it into the Commodore 64, preferably while it's off. Then you're going to want to turn on the system, go into Settings, and go into System Information. It'll notice that there's an update there. You're going to want to apply. And it'll take a little while, but eventually it will come back to the home screen. See you then.
So I've updated the system, and unfortunately I am still having the same speed issues. For what it's worth, I have contacted Retro Games through Facebook, and they don't seem to have an idea either. I recommended that they try to fix it in a firmware update, and I guess we'll see what comes from here. That being said, this update includes additional games, including some VIC-20 games and a Commodore Pet game, Pet Snake, which, considering it originally ran on a computer looking like this, is a bit of a technical feat, all things considered. That being said, all of the games included are either homebrew games from the modern day, or presumably license-free abandonware, such as Planet of Death, an early text adventure game on the VIC-20, and The Keep, which is admittedly a really technically impressive first-person dungeon crawler, again for the VIC-20. I admire it for what it is, but I think that if I were a general consumer, I probably wouldn't be too happy that the thing that I paid $130 for comes preloaded with Snake. So I'm glad that they made it an optional update. Just a few final things before we end the video. The first is loading your own games. It could not be more simple. All you need to do is drag and drop your favorite ROM or ROMs onto a USB stick, plug it in, and the system does all the work for you. The programs for the C64 are extremely small. Keep in mind we are talking about 40-year-old technology here. So you can easily fit the entire 10,000 plus library of C64 programs on a 4GB USB stick. You can boot the games up through this menu, or you can go through the classic menu to do it all manually. I find this is especially helpful for multi-loading cassette programs or programs that use both sides of a floppy disk. That being said, there are a few strange things that I noticed. One is that if you have over, I think, 270 titles, it's not going to display all of those titles. There seems to be some sort of limit per page. So if you have more than that, you're going to want to break them up. I recommend doing alphabetical order, and if you still have more than around 270 titles in one folder, just break them up into subfolders like A1, A2, A3, etc. The other thing is that while VIC-20 games are supposed to work, I haven't gotten them to. Most of the programs I've come across use the A0 file format, and maybe it's just that particular format that isn't supported, but I haven't had any luck getting my games to even register. And finally, I'd like to briefly touch upon Project Carousel. It originally started off as a tool to allow you to put your Commodore 64 programs on the C64's Carousel interface. Since then, however, it seems to have morphed into the sort of Swiss Army knife tool of the C64. You can install Linux on the system, RetroArch and the variety of emulators that support that. You can install the Vice emulator to allow you to have more tools and overall control over your games. It's really something. Honestly, I haven't really played with it, but it's something I might look into in the future.
And alas, we've come to the end of the video. You know there was a chapter select, right? You didn't have to watch the whole... Oh, never mind. So, what did I think of the system? Honestly, I had a ton of fun with this, even more than I thought. As I said, I didn't really have a ton of experience with the C64, or indeed early microcomputers before buying this system. I just thought it was really fascinating from what I've seen and what I've researched and things like that on YouTube. I've had a lot of experience with retro consoles like the NES, Intellivision, SNES, but computing is just a complete different beast. You have to learn how the operating system works, and to do that you need to learn codes and how to use the BASIC and things like that, which was fun to do. I had a lot of fun learning the BASIC, writing my own programs, and just trying out some of the weird and just insane games that were on this system. Consoles like the NES especially, you had to get it filtered through Nintendo's license. You couldn't have any, swearing games. You couldn't have any pornography. You couldn't have any games that might offend certain religious groups or whatever. But beyond that, games felt a lot more polished. Here, anybody could just write a game, put it on the store shelves, and it was up for the market to decide whether it was actually decent or not. This was sort of like the Steam or the Nintendo eShop before the Steam and Nintendo eShop. Anything went, really. So, what did I think of the games that were preloaded? Like I said, it's kind of a mixed bag overall. The only thing I would really complain about is some of the games I feel like they got a bit repetitive. For example, of the 64 games included on this system, 21 of them were released by Epix, which, fine, a lot of them are good games, but I feel like it's more so just, we had to get 64 games to do this cheap little pun, so we got Epix to license out most of their library to us, and some of these games are just padding. Which, I get it, licensing can be tricky, but I would have preferred less games over higher quality games, if that was the trade-off. Also, of the 64 games included, 19 of them were the same sort of style maze adventure games. I'm talking like Everyone's a Wally, Nodes of Yezod, Robin of the Wood. And yeah, I get that was sort of the style of the times. I mean, you couldn't really make an 80s compilation CD without some synthesizers, some MTV funk. But there was a ton of variety of games included on the system. Like I said, it wasn't until this recent update that we even got a text adventure, and those games were plentiful on the C64. Were many of them good? No, not really, but they were sort of a staple of the system. And if you want a good entry point into the Commodore 64's library, you gotta have some text-based adventure games, like The Hobbit or Sherlock Holmes. And again, licensing is always an issue, but I feel like some of these games are just abandonware at this point. I couldn't imagine anybody owns the license. That being said, out of every game on this system, I would say 32 of them are good. If you buy 64 games, in my opinion, half of them are genuinely pretty fun. Of the remaining 32, 14 of them, I would argue, are mediocre. So, not bad, but nothing you're gonna really go back to. 8 of them aren't very good in my opinion, but sort of had to be there. It's sort of like, you can't have a vinyl collection without Dark Side of the Moon. It doesn't matter whether you like the album or not, it's kind of one of those that you have to have, or like Born to Run or something like that. And it's the same here. You have to have the Impossible Mission games, as kind of janky as they might be by today's standards. And of the remaining 10 of them I thought were bad. I include games like I.O. and, of course, Heartland. So, this system cost $130. That's what I paid for it. So if we divide all of the games, we get a grand total of $2.03 per game. Those are the ones included. And of the ones that I actually thought were good, we're talking $3.25, $3.25. And that's not even including all of the games that you can insert yourself, and that's a really easy process. And 130 might sound like a lot, but keep in mind what you're getting. You're getting this system and a near identical replica of the C64, barring a couple of changes. You have a full-size keyboard that clearly is not cheap. In fact, the entire thing has a pretty decent build quality and a decent amount of weight considering what's actually in it. You have a micro switch controller, a bunch of USB ports, and you can load your own games on it. And it has 64 included. And Commodore Basic. Yeah, look at how much is included on here, and the 130, I think, really starts to justify itself. The other thing I must address is the controller. I've heard kind of mixed things about it. Some people like it, some people don't like it. I thought it was fine. It took a little while to get used to, mainly because I'm just not super into old joysticks and things like that. Like I said, I'm a console gamer mostly, so I'm used to playing with D-pads and thumbsticks. But C64 users, they would have played with something almost exactly like this. So I think for what it is, it's a pretty good thing. Again, it's a micro switch joystick. The buttons themselves are micro switch. And overall, it's a pretty neat thing. Now, if you don't like this controller, I wouldn't blame you because it's not for everybody. But thankfully, you can plug in certain controllers. Well, one specifically, one that I've tested, and that is the DualShock 3. And of course, this thing doesn't have Bluetooth, so it's going to be wired only. You're going to have to get a USB cable, plug it into the system, and it actually works pretty well aside from that. So, would I recommend this? Well, ultimately it's up to you, as they all say. But for me, I had a ton of fun with this. I'm going to continue tinkering around with this. Maybe I'll look into Project Carousel. Maybe I'll look into some of the other weirder, quirkier games. But for right now, good night and good luck.